Alright, what's going on everyone? In this video, I'll be showing you how to upgrade the Dimir Control Pioneer Challenger deck on a budget. Our goal is to get as close to the tier 1 deck as possible without spending more than the deck's retail price with our upgrades, which is around $40 to $50 USD. So if that currency isn't relevant to you, we're roughly spending the price of the deck or less. So let's make a quick comparison between an example of a competitive Dimir Control Pioneer list, shown on the left, with the Challenger deck you have out of the box on the right. So if we highlight in red the cards that are different, it's actually not that terrible. However, something you need to understand about control decks is that they are very different from deck to deck. At the end of the day, the goal is to kill creatures, counter spells, wipe the board, stuff like this, but there is rarely a definitive list when it comes to those spells. For example, one person might prefer Blood Chief's Thirst, another might prefer Infernal Grasp, a third might prefer Power Word Kill, right? So when you look at control lists, there's usually like specific cards that are very consistent with every deck, but there's also tons and tons and tons of variation. So let's not focus on things like, Soul Shatter and Drown in the Lock here, right? The problem with our deck isn't the spells, it is the lack of win conditions. So on the screen are the win conditions of multiple Dimir Control decks, with the Challenger deck on the bottom right here. Now, once again, you'll notice that decks play a wide variety of finishers. We have Shark Typhoons, we have Torrential Gearhulks, we have Hullbreaker Horrors, we have Sorens. Win conditions are all over the place because once again, there's no definitive list, there's no right answer. Some people prefer Hullbreaker Horrors and Soren, another person prefers Shark Typhoon, but what your deck lacks is numbers. The Challenger deck only has 3 win conditions, 5 if you count Murderous Rider, but the other decks are playing like 6 to 10. So that's what your deck is really missing, just a few more win conditions. Going out tomorrow and swapping a Soul Shatter for a Drown in the Lock isn't going to increase your win percentage, right? You could do that if that's your preference, but that's not gonna drastically improve your deck's ability to win. What's going to improve your chances of winning is just more win conditions, more ways to win the game in the first place. So first, let's take out one Consider for one Shark Typhoon. It's important to remember with Shark Typhoon is that if you have more than one of them, it's absolutely okay to cycle them in the early game. That's what Consider is doing, right? Consider is just a dig spell. It's pay a mana, dig for, a removal spell, dig for counters, dig for whatever you need. And when you have more than one Shark Typhoon, that's what it does in the early game. You just cycle it. You cycle it for 3, you get a chump blocker, maybe you kill something, and you dig another card deep, maybe looking for a board sweeper, maybe looking for a removal spell. Look for whatever you need and dig and stall. But in the late game, it becomes a game finisher. So this is a very good win condition for this deck. It's why most decks play 3 to 4 of them. So I also want to take out a Censor for a third Shark Typhoon for the same reason. Very similar, but also kind of the opposite. Censor is better early because it counters more consistently early, but then when we draw it in the late game, we usually ditch it. Shark Typhoon's kind of the opposite. We're okay with ditching it in the early game, but it becomes more relevant late. But the point is, they both dig, they both do something. In the Shark Typhoon, it just does it a little bit better typically. So we just need more win conditions, and this helps with that. Continuing with win conditions, the term of the video, we're going to take out 2 islands for 2 Hall of Storm Giants, and these are basically free win cons in the mana base. They enter untapped early, they enter tapped late. Doesn't really matter. Control decks usually aren't super picky about lands entering untapped. We're not trying to curve out with a 2-drop into a 3-drop into a 4-drop with this deck, so that's fine. And then in the late game, it animates into a 7/7 to beat the opponent down with. So free win condition and the mana base, definitely want that. So I'd like to add one more win condition to get our ratio correct, and the obvious cut is dig through time. This is incredibly common, but most decks only play 1 or 2 because they're a little clunky in the early game, which is why most decks don't play a ton of these. You definitely want them, they're amazing, but not 3 to 4 copies. So I think we should cut one of these for one more card that can win the game, and the question is, which card should it be? And as I mentioned, control decks vary wildly from player to player, so we have a lot of options. The most popular are Soren, Kalitas, Ashiok. These 3 are very popular. Kalitas is probably the most popular, but it's also the most expensive. It's almost always either found in the main board or on the side. You'll either see it in the main board. If you don't see it in the main, there's a good chance there's like one in the sideboard. So that's great, but they're like $30, so we're not going there. Ashiok's on the opposite side of the spectrum. It is much cheaper. It's the cheapest option, but it's the least common. But Sorin is like right in the middle. And it's also my personal preference. I like that he draws cards in control matchups, but then in aggro matchups, he makes 2/3 lifelinkers, right? That's perfect for aggro matchups. Blocks well and also gains life. Perfect for red aggro. So I'm a big fan of Sorin, so I'm going to recommend Sorin. He is like $12 each though. So even though this is like my official recommendation, honestly, dig through time for basically any good win condition. If you have like an Ashiok, that's fine. If you happen to own a Kalitas, that's great. Do that. And there's plenty more you could add here too, like Urtai is common, Emerith and Shieldred here as well is perfect. If you want to add either of these, that's fine. Emerith was in another Challenger deck, so you might have one of those, and I've seen Emerith and Dimir Control decks in Pioneer. Not very commonly, I've seen a few deck lists with it, but it does exist, so Emerith is fine, Shieldred's fine, Ledger Shredder, Brazen Borrower, Jace, Vryn's Prodigy, all of these are honestly fine here. So there's plenty you can add here. I'm going to say Sorin is my official recommendation, but it's $12 and feel free to experiment here. If you're looking at $12 and you're like, I don't know if I want to spend $12 on a Sorin, that's fine. Go try Emerith. Emerith is also pretty good here. It's really just about preference. I mean, even top tier competitive decks, they're not like consistently playing Sorin. Sorin's in like 40% of decks or something. It's, not in every single deck, so that's fine. Next, I want to look at the mana base. Your deck has 4 copies of Field of Ruin. Field of Ruin is great. It blows up your opponent's creature lands, which is awesome. But most decks only play like 2 of these. So first, let's take out one for a Fetid Pools. This is just a pretty awesome dual land. It's relatively cheap and it can be cycled in the late game, which is nice. And as I mentioned earlier, as a control deck, we're not too fussy about lands entering untapped. I also want to take out another Field of Ruin for a Castle Vantress. This can scry in the late game, and we can do that at instant speed, so we do it at the end of our opponent's turn, right? Hold up our mana, hold up counter spells. If our opponent doesn't do anything relevant, we pay for tap it, scry, look for more counter spells and more removal, so that's fine. And as for the sideboard, I think this is impressively built actually. I've been pretty happy with many of these sideboards. I have very few complaints. Maybe there could be a Thoughtseize or a Kalitas, but both of these are kind of expensive, so the duress that's there is fine. I think what's really missing is Ether Gust. This has become popular recently with the rise of like dual mid-range and whatnot, so if you want to, you can cut out a duress for an Ether Gust. That's probably just fine. And that's basically it. There is of course plenty more we can do. The mana base is missing many expensive lands, shock lands, pathways, utility lands like Otawara. This is also popular. All of these are very expensive, so we won't be adding these, but something to consider there. But this deck was surprisingly competent out of the box. It was like the most complete, except for the part where it didn't have any win conditions, which made it feel like it's like this weird thing where it felt like it was the worst deck because of the lack of win conditions, but the main board was like 90% complete, so it was kind of a weird thing. But either way, we just needed to fix that win condition ratio, and suddenly it's looking pretty good. So there you go. As I've been saying, I encourage you to experiment and to explore other deck lists, as this archetype has a lot of volatility in how the decks are constructed, so you may find a build that's more suitable to your playstyle. You might find different win conditions that you prefer. That's fine. If you want to change the ratios of counters and removal, that's fine. Some decks do play 3 board sweepers. Yours has 2, so you could add like a Shadow's Verdict. That's pretty common, though your deck does have a couple in the sideboard. So there's plenty of room to experiment. With control decks, you really want to be open to adjusting ratios of counter and control and stuff. But regardless, this should definitely make your deck much more capable of closing out games, so I hope that helps. Be sure to check the description for a link to the official deck list. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I will see you in the next one.